The first thing you notice when you look at photographs of Soviet citizens from the 1960s through the 1980s is the glint of metal when they smile. Gold teeth, gold crowns, gold caps gleaming from mouths across the breadth of the Soviet Union, from Moscow to Vladivostok, from Leningrad to Tashkent. This wasn't a fashion statement born from vanity or a symbol of criminal underworld affiliation, as Western observers sometimes assumed. The prevalence of gold dental work in the USSR was the direct consequence of systemic failures in Soviet healthcare infrastructure, ideological rigidity in economic planning, material shortages that defined everyday life, and paradoxically, the state's commitment to universal healthcare access. To understand why millions of Soviet citizens walked around with mouths full of gold requires understanding the fundamental contradictions at the heart of the Soviet system itself. The story begins not with dentistry but with the Bolshevik promise made in the aftermath of the October Revolution of 1917. The new Soviet state committed itself to providing free, universal health care to all citizens, a revolutionary concept at a time when medical care in most of the world remained a luxury available only to those who could afford it. Vladimir Lenin himself declared that health care was a right, not a privilege, and the early Soviet government moved quickly to nationalize hospitals, clinics, and medical facilities. By 1920, the People's Commissariat of Health, established under Nikolai Semashko, had created a framework for a unified, state-run healthcare system that would theoretically serve every Soviet citizen from cradle to grave. This included dental care, which was integrated into the broader healthcare infrastructure as an essential service rather than a cosmetic luxury. The principle was admirable and genuinely progressive for its time. The execution, however, would prove far more complicated. The Soviet Union inherited a largely agrarian, economically devastated country from the ruins of the Russian Empire and the catastrophic losses of World War I and the subsequent Civil War. By 1922, when the USSR was formally established, the country faced shortages of everything from trained medical professionals to basic medical supplies. The dental profession in particular had been relatively underdeveloped in pre-revolutionary Russia, with most dental care concentrated in major cities and available primarily to the wealthy. The Bolsheviks now faced the task of providing dental care to a population of over 140 million people spread across the largest country on Earth, and they had to do it with limited resources and a shortage of trained dentists. The Soviet approach to solving this problem reflected the broader logic of central planning that would come to define the entire system. Rather than allowing market forces to determine the distribution of dental services and materials, the state would control every aspect of dental care, from the training of dentists to the production and allocation of dental materials. Dental schools were established and expanded throughout the 1920s and 1930s, and the number of dentists in the Soviet Union grew substantially. By 1940, the USSR had approximately 18,000 dentists serving the population, a significant increase from the pre-revolutionary period, but still far below what was needed. The ratio of dentists to population remained problematic throughout Soviet history, with chronic shortages particularly acute in rural areas and smaller cities. The material shortages that would eventually lead to the ubiquity of gold teeth began to crystallize in the 1930s as Stalin's industrialization drive reshaped the Soviet economy. The first five-year plan, launched in 1928, prioritized heavy industry, military production, and infrastructure development. Consumer goods and medical supplies fell far down the list of priorities. The production of modern dental materials, including high-quality porcelain for crowns, advanced composite materials, and specialized dental ceramics, required industrial capacity, chemical expertise, and supply chains that the Soviet Union either lacked or chose not to develop. The command economy operated on the principle of allocating resources according to state priorities, and dental materials simply were not a priority when weighed against ties, steel production, tank manufacturing, or hydroelectric dam construction. The situation was exacerbated by World War II, which devastated the Soviet Union between 1941 and 1945. The war killed approximately 27 million Soviet citizens, destroyed vast swaths of industrial capacity, and consumed virtually all available resources. The dental care infrastructure, never robust to begin with, was further degraded. Factories that might have produced dental materials were converted to military production. Dentists were conscripted into military service. The civilian population, facing malnutrition and stress, experienced deteriorating dental health on a massive scale. When the war ended, the Soviet Union faced the monumental task of reconstruction, and once again, dental materials were not a priority in the allocation of resources. In the post-war period, as the Soviet Union rebuilt and entered the Cold War competition with the United States and Western Europe, the logic of resource allocation remained unchanged. The Soviet leadership under Stalin and later Khrushchev poured resources into nuclear weapons development, space exploration, military expansion, and heavy industry. The successful test of the Soviet atomic bomb in 1949, the launch of Sputnik in 1957, and the ongoing arms race with the West consumed enormous portions of the Soviet budget and industrial capacity. Meanwhile, the production of consumer goods and medical supplies continued to lag far behind demand. Soviet citizens became accustomed to shortages of everything from toilet paper to antibiotics, and dental materials were no exception. By the 1950s, Soviet dentists faced a persistent and worsening shortage of modern dental materials. High-quality porcelain for dental crowns was difficult to obtain. When it was available, it was often of poor quality, prone to cracking and discoloration. Composite filling materials were scarce and unreliable. The Soviet chemical industry focused on producing plastics for industrial and military applications, devoted little capacity to developing the specialized polymers and resins needed for modern dentistry. Dental cement was often substandard. The supply chains that did exist were unreliable, with materials arriving sporadically and in insufficient quantities. Dentists in provincial cities and rural areas had it worst, sometimes going months without access to basic supplies. Faced with these chronic shortages, Soviet dentists turned to a solution that was both practical and deeply rooted in dental tradition: gold. Gold had been used in dentistry for thousands of years, prized for its unique combination of properties. It is biologically inert, causing no adverse reactions in the human body. It is malleable, allowing dentists to shape it precisely to fit individual teeth. It is durable, lasting decades or even a lifetime without corroding or degrading. It is soft enough to work with using relatively simple tools, yet strong enough to withstand the forces of chewing. For Soviet dentists working with limited equipment and unreliable supplies of modern materials, gold was often the most reliable option available. The Soviet state, despite its general shortage of consumer goods, had access to significant gold reserves. The USSR was one of the world's largest gold producers, with major mining operations in Siberia, the Urals, and the Far East. The Kolyma region in northeastern Siberia, site of some of the most notorious Gulag labor camps, produced enormous quantities of gold, extracted through the forced labor of political prisoners. By the 1960s, the Soviet Union was producing approximately 200 tons of gold annually. making it the second largest gold producer in the world after South Africa. While much of this gold went to state reserves, used to purchase Western technology and grain, or to back the ruble, the state also allocated gold for industrial and medical purposes, including dentistry. The pricing structure of Soviet healthcare created additional incentives for the use of gold in dental work. Because healthcare was provided free at the point of service, Soviet citizens did not directly pay for most medical procedures. However, dental work involving precious metals operated under a different system. Patients receiving gold dental work were required to pay for the gold itself, though not for the dentist's labor or the procedure. The state set the price of dental gold at official rates that were significantly below the international market price and even below the domestic black market price for gold. This meant that having gold dental work done was actually an economically rational choice for Soviet citizens who could afford it. They were essentially purchasing gold at a discount and having it installed in their mouths by a skilled professional at no additional labor cost. This economic calculation became even more compelling given the instability and unreliability of the Soviet financial system. The ruble was not convertible to foreign currency and suffered from periodic devaluations and currency reforms. The most dramatic of these occurred in 1961, when Khrushchev's government redenominated the ruble at a rate of 10-1, effectively wiping out much of the population's savings. Soviet citizens learned to distrust paper money and bank deposits, preferring to store wealth in tangible assets that would retain value regardless of government policy. Gold dental work became a form of portable, concealable wealth that served a practical purpose while also functioning as a hedge against economic uncertainty. A mouthful of gold represented both functional teeth and a small fortune that could potentially be liquidated in times of crisis. The cultural acceptance and even embrace of gold teeth in Soviet society reflected these practical realities. Unlike in Western countries where visible gold dental work was often associated with poverty, criminality, or poor taste, in the Soviet Union it carried no such stigma. Gold teeth were common among all social classes, from factory workers to university professors to government officials. Photographs from the Brezhnev era show Soviet citizens from all walks of life displaying gold dental work without embarrassment or self-consciousness. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn, in his accounts of life in the Gulag and later in Soviet society, noted the prevalence of gold teeth as an unremarkable feature of everyday life. The dissident physicist Andrei Sakharov, in his memoirs, mentioned gold dental work as a routine aspect of medical care. For Soviet citizens, gold teeth were simply a normal part of life, a practical solution to the problem of dental decay in a system that could not reliably provide alternatives. The actual process of getting gold dental work in the Soviet Union involved navigating the complexities of the Soviet healthcare system. A patient would visit a state dental clinic, usually attached to a workplace, school, or residential district. After examination, if the dentist determined that a tooth required a crown or cap, the patient would be presented with options. If porcelain or other materials were available, they might be offered, but often they were not, or the dentist might recommend against them due to quality concerns. If the patient chose gold, they would be required to purchase the gold through official channels. The amount needed would be calculated based on the size and type of restoration required, typically between 2 and 5 grams per tooth. The patient would pay for the gold at the state set price, receive a receipt, and the gold would be allocated to the dentist for the procedure. The quality of the actual dental work varied enormously depending on the skill of the dentist and the resources available at the particular clinic. Major cities like Moscow and Leningrad had better-equipped dental clinics with more experienced dentists. Provincial cities and rural areas often had less skilled practitioners working with more primitive equipment. The Soviet dental education system produced large numbers of dentists, but the quality of training was inconsistent. Some Soviet dentists were highly skilled professionals who took pride in their work. Others were poorly trained and overworked, seeing dozens of patients per day in clinics that were understaffed and undersupplied. The result was that some Soviet citizens received excellent gold dental work that lasted for decades, while others received crude, poorly fitted restorations that caused ongoing problems. The visibility of gold dental work in the Soviet Union also reflected cultural attitudes toward dentistry and oral health that differed from those in the West. Soviet dental care emphasized treatment of acute problems rather than preventive care. Regular dental checkups and cleanings were less common than in Western countries. Fluoridation of water supplies was limited. Dental hygiene education was inconsistent. The Soviet diet, heavy on sugar and carbohydrates, contributed to high rates of dental decay. By the time many Soviet citizens sought dental care, their teeth were severely damaged, requiring extensive restorative work. The preference for gold crowns that covered entire teeth, rather than more conservative treatments that preserved more of the natural tooth structure, was partly a function of this pattern of delayed treatment. The 1970s and 1980s saw the peak of gold dental work in the Soviet Union. By this period, the system had reached a kind of equilibrium. The chronic shortages of modern dental materials persisted despite periodic campaigns to improve healthcare quality. The Soviet economy under Brezhnev had entered the period later known as the era of stagnation, characterized by declining growth rates, increasing inefficiency, and growing gaps between the Soviet standard of living and that of the West. The gerontocratic leadership showed little interest in addressing the systemic problems that led to shortages of consumer goods and medical supplies. Meanwhile, Soviet gold production remained high, and the system of providing gold dental work at subsidized prices continued to function. Millions of Soviet citizens received gold dental restorations during these decades, creating the visual phenomenon that would become so closely associated with the late Soviet period. The social and economic functions of gold teeth extended beyond their immediate practical purpose. In the informal economy that existed alongside the official Soviet system, gold teeth could serve as collateral or even currency. There were documented cases of people having gold teeth removed and sold to access cash for emergencies or to purchase scarce goods. The black market for gold operated throughout Soviet history, and dental gold, while less pure than bullion, still had significant value. Criminal networks sometimes targeted individuals with extensive gold dental work. Though such crimes were officially denied or underreported by Soviet authorities reluctant to acknowledge crime statistics, the state itself was not above reclaiming dental gold. There were reports of gold being extracted from corpses before cremation, though the extent of this practice is difficult to verify. The international perception of Soviet gold teeth became entangled with Cold War stereotypes and propaganda. Western observers often cited the prevalence of gold dental work as evidence of Soviet backwardness and the failure of the communist system to provide modern health care. American and European news reports and photographs from the Soviet Union frequently highlighted gold teeth as a visual shorthand for Soviet otherness and inferiority. This interpretation was not entirely wrong. The reliance on gold dental work did reflect genuine shortcomings in the Soviet healthcare and economic systems. However, it also reflected a degree of cultural misunderstanding. Western observers often failed to appreciate the rational economic calculations that made gold dental work an attractive option for Soviet citizens, or the fact that the Soviet system, despite its many failures, did provide universal access to dental care, something that remained unavailable to millions of Americans and Europeans. The situation began to change only in the final years of the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the late 1980s, including glasnost and perestroika, opened the Soviet economy to limited market mechanisms and foreign trade. Western dental materials began to appear in Soviet clinics, though in limited quantities and primarily in major cities. The generation of dentists trained in the 1980s had greater exposure to international dental practices and techniques. Some private dental practices began to emerge, operating in a legal gray area and catering to those who could pay for higher quality care. However, these changes came too late and affected too few people to significantly alter the prevalence of gold dental work before the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991. The post-Soviet period brought dramatic changes to dentistry in Russia and the former Soviet republics. The transition to market economies meant that the old system of state-provided dental care largely collapsed. Many state dental clinics closed or were privatized. The subsidized provision of dental gold ended. At the same time, the opening of borders and the integration into the global economy meant that modern dental materials became widely available for the first time. A new generation of privately trained dentists established practices offering Western-style cosmetic dentistry. For those who could afford it, porcelain crowns, composite fillings, and eventually dental implants became available. The new post-Soviet middle class, eager to adopt Western standards and aesthetics, began to view gold teeth as embarrassing relics of the Soviet past. Yet the legacy of Soviet gold teeth persists. Millions of people who received gold dental work in the Soviet era continue to wear it decades later, a testament to gold's durability and the quality of at least some Soviet dental work. In Russia and other former Soviet states, gold teeth remain common among older generations, visible reminders of the system in which they lived most of their lives. For the generation that came of age after 1991, gold teeth have become markers of age and class associated with grandparents and with those who cannot afford modern dental care. The cultural meaning of gold teeth has inverted. What was once normal and unremarkable has become a stigmatized sign of poverty or outdated aesthetics. The story of gold teeth in the Soviet Union encapsulates many of the central contradictions and failures of the Soviet system. It demonstrates how ideological commitment to universal social services could coexist with chronic material shortages and economic inefficiency. It shows how central planning created bizarre distortions, making gold cheaper and more available than porcelain or plastic. It illustrates how Soviet citizens adapted to systemic failures, making rational choices within an irrational system. It reveals how the Cold War competition led to the prioritization of military and prestige projects at the expense of everyday quality of life. And it exemplifies how the Soviet Union could simultaneously achieve genuine accomplishments, like universal healthcare access, while failing to provide the basic materials needed to make that healthcare modern and effective. The phenomenon also offers insight into how historical memory and cultural meaning shift over time. What was once a practical solution and an unremarkable feature of daily life has become a symbol, a visual shorthand for an entire era. For those who lived through the Soviet period, gold teeth might evoke complex memories of a system that provided security and stability alongside shortage and frustration. For younger generations with no direct memory of the USSR, gold teeth have become almost folkloric, a curious detail of a vanished world. For Western observers, they remain a potent symbol, though one often interpreted through the distorting lens of Cold War triumphalism rather than genuine historical understanding. In the end, the prevalence of gold teeth in the Soviet Union was not the result of any single cause, but rather the convergence of multiple factors. The commitment to universal health care without the economic means to fully realize it, the command economy's inability to produce or prioritize modern dental materials, the availability of gold from Soviet mines. the economic logic that made gold teeth a rational investment, and the cultural acceptance that followed from these material realities. It was a distinctly Soviet phenomenon, possible only in a system that combined state control of healthcare and gold production with chronic shortages and economic irrationality. The glint of gold in millions of Soviet smiles was not merely a dental choice, but a reflection of the system itself, its promises and failures, its peculiar logic and its ultimate unsustainability. Today, as those gold teeth gradually disappear with the generations that wore them, they remain a tangible link to a vanished world, a small but telling detail in the vast and complex history of the Soviet experiment.